You guys probably clicked on this video because your car is misfiring, or you're an OG and you're subscribed to the channel, or you just want to learn something, and that's okay too. Either way, by the end of this video, you guys are going to be able to diagnose a misfire in your car. Whether it's a high horsepower track car, just a regular street car, this is how you diagnose a misfire. The first thing I want to mention about a misfire in your car is that you are going to notice it one of three ways. Telltale sign number one, your check engine light just came on. Obviously, your number one first thought is to go grab a scan tool and scan for codes. Now, when you scan for codes, you're going to have either a P0300, which is a random cylinder misfire, or you're going to have a P0301, 302, 303, 304, on and on and on. As many cylinders as your car has, that last number indicates the cylinder that the misfire is on. So in my case, on the Subaru right now, we have a P0302, which means that it is a cylinder 2 misfire. Another indication of a misfire in your car, and this means that the misfire is getting pretty bad. Your check engine light starts flashing. This is what happened to the Subaru the other day. Oh, that was a check engine light. Whoa! Whoa! Pretty bad, right? She started breaking up right in the middle of a pull. When it's flashing, that's basically your ECU yelling at you saying, holy shit, I can't fix the problem, we need help. And you, as the mechanic you're gonna be after watching this video, is gonna fix that problem so that ECU can run that engine perfectly. And just to put this into perspective for you guys so you understand what I'm talking about, the ECU in your car or the computer is gonna do absolutely everything it can to correct or fix an issue before it needs you to fix something. And that check engine light, is it asking for help? Because it couldn't fix the issue. So for example, let's say that you have a intake leak. Your car is going to end up running rich because you're losing that air on the intake side of the engine. So since you're losing air and the ECU is still commanding that much fuel, typically it would set a check engine light for a rich condition. But what your ECU is gonna do if it's a very, very minor vacuum leak, what it's gonna do is it's actually gonna take away some fuel to even out that air to fuel ratio. And that's something, if you guys are mechanics yourselves, you will know that's why you monitor your fuel trims. That's why you monitor your upstream and downstream O2 sensors, but we're not getting that far into depth with this. The point is your ECU is gonna try and correct and take away fuel to make up for the loss of air. And if it's small, it's gonna correct that issue for you. You're never gonna see a check engine light. You're not gonna know there's an issue there. So your car is gonna do the same thing with a misfire. It's gonna change whatever it can to try and compensate for that misfire, whether it's adding more fuel, taking away fuel, changing your ignition timing, whatever it needs to do to try and correct that misfire. Then the third way that you are gonna detect a misfire in your car without the check engine light coming on is you're probably gonna feel it. You're gonna feel the car sputtering just like in that video that I just showed you guys. So now that we know how you can tell your car is misfiring, we can talk about why it's misfiring. And this is how you diagnose a misfire every single time. When it comes to an engine running properly, you need four things. You need spark, you need fuel, you need air, and you need a way to compress that air. And those all go together to make a nice, happy, smooth running engine. Now spark, number one cause of this is burnt out spark plugs. I wish I had an example to show you guys, but I don't really have any burnt out plugs here right now. I'll throw a couple images on the screen of what an iridium tip spark plug looks like. When the entire tip's gone, you can see the gap between the spark plug tip and the end of the spark plug. You could call it the center electrode and the outer electrode, or the center electrode and the ground electrode. This center electrode is technically the positive because the current is coming through that center electrode and jumps that gap to the ground electrode, which is grounded through your engine block. Now let's talk about the part that creates the spark, which you guys probably already know, or if you don't, then you learned something new today. This is called your ignition coil. And in modern cars nowadays, your ignition coils just have one wiring connector that plugs into them, which is called a coil on plug ignition system. And what this does is your engine is timed electronically. When your piston is at top dead center of the compression stroke about to come down on that power stroke, this ignition coil sends a shit ton of current through the spark plug to create that spark. And that's where you get all the horsies from. Now, there's a couple things that can go wrong with these ignition coils. They have a primary and secondary coil winding in them. Sometimes those coil windings can break internally, sometimes they can short out internally. There's lots of different problems, but unfortunately, with a coil unplug system where it's just a connector into an ignition coil like this, you're not really able to test them. All you can do to verify that an ignition coil is bad is move it to a different cylinder, because every single ignition coil on your car is interchangeable. So we're gonna go over this a bit more in a sec, but in my situation, we have a P0302. Like I mentioned before, cylinder 2 misfire. So on a Subaru, you got cylinder 1 and 3 on the passenger side, 1 being the front cylinder, 3 being the rear, and then you got cylinder 2 and 4 on this side, 2 being the front and 4 being the rear. So the most common practice on diagnosing a bad ignition coil is to remove this ignition coil from cylinder 2. You're going to remove the ignition coil from cylinder 4. You're going to swap them out. So you're going to put the cylinder 2 ignition coil in cylinder 4, the cylinder 4 ignition coil in cylinder 2, and then you're going to take the car for a drive. When the misfire comes back, if that misfire changes from cylinder 2 to cylinder 4, you know that that ignition coil is bad because you moved it to cylinder 4 and now the misfire followed it. So in that situation, you would be buying a new ignition coil, which I'm 90% sure is the cause of our misfire today. My fingers are crossed. Let's hope it's not the motor, boys. Another issue that an ignition coil could have, not sending the proper current to the spark plug, is wiring, which I'm sure is all of your guys' favorite, right? Well, it actually is my favorite because wiring's easy. If any of the wiring to your ignition coil is corroded, has high resistance, has broken wires, anything like that, that ignition coil is not going to be able to send the proper current to the spark plug, and you can also get a misfire that way. We're jumping to number 2 on the list, which was fuel. If you're getting a individual cylinder misfire like a P0301, 302, 303, etc., you're most likely looking at an injector if it's going to be a fueling issue. But the only way you're going to start chasing a fuel issue is if you've already ruled out that the car has spark by moving that ignition coil, swapping out the spark plug. Another thing I forgot to mention about the spark plug was the gap between that inner or center electrode to the ground electrode. There is a specific gap that manufacturers want between those two. Make sure every time you buy a set of plugs that you're checking the gap on your spark plugs before you install them. But back to fuel. If you have a bad injector, you're most likely going to have a single cylinder misfire. You can do the same thing with an injector as you can with an ignition coil because they are not specific to a certain cylinder. You can pull the cylinder 2 injector off and pull the cylinder 4 injector off, flip positions with those, and then if your misfire follows to cylinder 4, there's your issue, the injector. But if it doesn't follow, you're still chasing down that misfire. And that's the beauty of diagnosing misfires, is it could be so many different things. And that's why we're going through them all right now. Now, the last couple things I am going to touch on in the fuel category is also wiring. Injectors are always a 2-wire circuit because an injector is technically a solenoid. It opens and closes to allow fuel into your engine. So you have a positive wire and you have a ground wire. On, I'm pretty sure 95% of vehicles, the positive wire should always have 12 volts on it, and your ground wire is ground controlled by the ECU. And what that means is your ECU opens and closes the ground to open that injector at the perfect time to spray fuel. Like I said, right at the top of that compression stroke, right as it comes down on the power stroke, you want fuel spraying in there to ignite that spark and create that horsepower, baby. Now here's the last point about fuel. A random cylinder misfire is usually caused by something that controls all the cylinders at the same time, like fuel supply to the engine. So a fuel pump, fuel lines, anything like that. And usually when you have a random cylinder misfire code, it also comes with many other codes like a 301, 302, 303. It will show you individual misfire codes for a whole bunch of cylinders. Now on to the next category, which I'm gonna say these next two kind of go hand in hand, but we're gonna start with air. How do you create a fire? You guys have been camping before, or you made a fire in your backyard. You need an ignition source and you need oxygen. That creates fire. So in a car, your ignition source, these two guys right here, a spark plug and an ignition coil. Now, oxygen. This is where the air category comes in. You need air coming into that engine in order to create that explosion inside your engine. Like I said, to create all the horsies. And usually if you have any type of intake leak and it's not giving the engine adequate enough air for the amount of fuel it's supplying, you're most likely gonna get a random cylinder misfire, and it's gonna be misfiring on multiple cylinders because the air supply into an engine is kind of a group effort. All of these pipes and the intake manifold and the turbo, on a naturally aspirated car, you're not gonna have the turbo, but all of this stuff kind of works together to achieve one goal, and that's to pull air into that engine. So as long as that throttle body's opening up, as long as you got airflow in the engine, you should be good in the air department. Now that we know that we have air coming into the engine, the next kicker is, can the engine compress that air? And this is where we're getting into the territory of what people don't like to hear. You might have an internal engine failure. No one wants to admit it. Most people just don't even want to do a compression test because it's going to hurt your feelings when you see the bad numbers. So in your engine, there's lots of moving parts inside that create that compression. But realistically, only 3 of them matter. That's your valves, your piston, and your piston rings. First, let's talk about piston rings. If you have bad piston rings, they're not sealing to the cylinder. You're not able to get good compression because the compressed air is leaking past those piston rings. You're gonna have low compression on that cylinder, and since that cylinder has a lower compression than all of the rest of the cylinders, that's when you get that specific code for a specific cylinder. And the only way to check that is with a compression test, which we're also gonna do in this video. But now that we mentioned piston rings on how that can lose compression, let's talk about the valves. Your car always has an intake valve and an exhaust valve. Your intake valve is what opens up to pull air into the cylinder, and then it'll shut. Both valves will be shut. That's when that piston comes up and compresses that air, comes down on the power stroke, and then when it comes back up, that hot combustion air and gases need to escape. So what opens up? Your exhaust valve. And then it pushes all of that combustible air out the exhaust. And that's what makes the cool sounds. So what happens if one of those valves is either A, burnt, or B, just not sealing? You're not gonna be able to build as much compression because you have air leaking out of that cylinder. And that's what I was talking about before when it comes to the engine being able to compress the air that's getting pumped into it. So really the only ways that you can test for an internal engine failure is with a compression test or leak down test. A compression test is gonna give you specific numbers on each cylinder, and what you're looking for is to make sure that all your cylinders are within 5 to 10 psi of each other. Now, as you do a compression test, that piston's going up and down, those valves are opening and closing, and it's gonna read how much compression you have over a certain amount of strokes as you're cranking the engine over. And once you do that compression test and you find a cylinder that's low, how do you know what the problem is? Really, the only way that you can figure out what the problem is after a compression test without tearing the engine apart is a leak down test. Now, a leak down test is cranking your piston to top dead center of the compression stroke on that specific cylinder. You're gonna be pumping a bunch of air into that cylinder with the valves completely closed. You're gonna be checking your intake for leaks because if that intake valve is not sealed, you're gonna have air hissing out of the intake, whether it's coming out of the intake manifold, throttle body, it's gonna be coming out somewhere. If your exhaust valve is not sealed, you're gonna hear air hissing out of the exhaust of the car. And if your piston rings are leaking, well, you're gonna hear air coming out of the crankcase of the engine, which is out of your PCV valve, out of any of your valve cover breather ports, anything like that. You're even gonna hear it coming out of your oil cap. And that is worst case scenario. So that was a lot of information to take in at once if you're new to this, and not a lot of me showing you how to do it. I'm sure we can all agree on that. All talk, no show. Now I'm gonna show you guys. We're gonna fix this Subaru together. Plus, in this video, I'm also just gonna be swapping out all 4 spark plugs because we are going to the track in 2 days on this thing. This car is making 512 wheel horsepower and 440 torque. Those are both Mustang dyno numbers, and these spark plugs probably got 15,000 K on them. First thing you guys should know is where your OBD2 port is so that you can plug a scan tool in to read your codes. On almost every single vehicle in the world, your OBD2 port is located underneath the dash. Mine is right here. I just have my Cobb access port plugged into it. So you're gonna plug your scan tool into there, and we're gonna read the codes. So in my situation, I have a Cobb access port that can also read check engine codes. And would you look at that? Cylinder 2 misfire detected. And that P00000 is just saying that this is a misfire related code. Scroll down, you got your P0302. So we gotta fix that. Now again, me just using logic before I even jump into this, if I had a burnt exhaust valve, I would have a misfire all the time. Now the car is running perfectly fine. It only misfires under load, like I showed you guys in the video at the beginning of this video. Just to prove she runs good with no misfires, let's fire it up right now. See that? She's running right now, perfectly fine, no misfires. Another thing you can do if you have a scan tool nearby, you can monitor the roughness or misfires on each individual cylinder, which is what we are gonna do while we're driving once we move this ignition coil over and swap our spark plugs out. And set the gap to 30 thousandths of an inch. I gotta grab my feeler blades, but let's get to it. So we got all of the ignition coils and all the spark plugs pulled out of this thing now. I got them all numbered from cylinder 1 all the way through 4. And this is actually a little sus because I'm pretty sure this is the newest ignition coil. I must have moved them around before. This is the one that was on cylinder 2. It's an aftermarket one, but there's no way to test it other than moving it to another cylinder. But before we do that, since that is the newest ignition coil, I did decide to whip out the good old compression tester. So we're gonna see if we find something that we don't want to find right now because we're going to the track in T-2 days. Also, another thing I want to mention is the burn pattern on these spark plugs could not be any better. They are like the perfect gray burn. So that just tells you that you got a good tuner and that she's running perfect. So on a compressor tester, you got an O-ring that seals it kind of like the crush washer does on the spark plug. This threads into your spark plug hole. Hook up the compressor tester and I'll show you guys what to do from there. One more thing to mention before we go ahead and do this. When you're doing a compression test, you need to have your throttle wide open. So put your foot to the floor on the gas pedal. We got all our ignition coils unplugged so there won't be any firing whatsoever. The engine's not going to start. And on this specific model of STI, when you put your foot to the floor when you're starting it, it cuts fuel anyways. So we're gonna crank this over until that needle hits its peak compression and stops moving, pretty much. Last time I compression tested this car, this shitty compression tester said 100 PSI. Let's see what we got on cylinder 2, boys. Moment of truth. I am an idiot. Man, I'm dumb sometimes. I guess you kind of need a freaking battery in the thing to crank it over, hey? Forgot about that part. Give us good news, Stacy girl. I'm scared. I don't even want to look at it. You guys can see it before me. 90. Lower than last time by a little bit. I think she was at 100 last time I checked this thing. We're gonna say that's bad news. But if all of our other cylinders compression test at 90 PSI, she's mint. All right, cylinder 4. Hey, that's what we like to see. 90 PSI on that one too. That battery was also cranking real slow on that one. So we're gonna test out this new battery tester from TopDon. See if this thing actually works and see if it's legit. Hook up our positive and negative here. Let's see if this thing works. Battery test. This battery is a 570 cold cranking amp battery. Let's test it, see what happens. Oh, so it's not failing the battery. It's just saying to retest after charging. It says it's making 225 cold cranking amps right now, and it's only at 11.7 volts, so she's low on charge. Oh wow, it actually tells you your internal resistance as well. Cool. You also got a cranking test, charging test. Nice, I like it. So our battery's not bad, just needs to be charged. But I don't want to hook up a charger, so I picked up this little booster pack thing from Canadian Tire. I'm waiting to get my matching TopDon jump starter. But for now, we got the Motomaster one. Let's crank this over one more time. Release there, see what she's got. Hopefully it's the same. Wow, did that ever crank faster. And with a little bit more cranking power, we got 100 PSI. So if we go back to cylinder 1, we're probably gonna have 100 PSI there too. It was just cranking real slow. So let's disconnect this and hop over to the other side. And we got like 105 on that one. Last cylinder is cylinder 3. 105 PSI. So we're pretty even. 105 PSI, baby. We are even on all 4 cylinders. So now that we've ruled out an internal engine failure, we just pulled the spark plugs and the spark plugs looks amazing. So those are definitely not the cause, even though we're slapping new ones in anyways. But for now, just for diagnosing purposes, I'm not gonna install my brand new ignition coil. We're gonna swap 2 and 4, and we are gonna be putting in 4 brand new NGK Iridium spark plugs. Sweet, she's running again, boys. This intercooler pipe is just set in there right now. I don't have the clamps tightened up or anything. And the battery's not installed. I just ran it off the jumper pack because the good old TopDon battery tester told me to charge it. And it was right because we got it on a slow charger now and it says she's 50% charged. So we're gonna leave that charge overnight. So on the access port, I added the gauge monitors, roughness cylinder 1, cylinder 2, cylinder 3, and cylinder 4. Now when we take this on a road test, when we do pulls, we should see those roughness counts start to climb on cylinder 4. And my jumper pack just cut out, but you get the point. Okay, we're out cruising now. I put my foot into it a couple times and I don't know what's going on with the car right now. It keeps jumping to like a 9 AFR running super rich and it's still misfiring on cylinder 2. So let's give it a little bit of gas so you can see the AFR is already jumping. It feels like the car is just lugging and it's running super, super rich. See right there, that's a 9 AFR. It's got like insane misfires. Now, what the hell is going on here? That was 42 misfire counts on cylinder 2, but there's no consistent misfire. Like, this is only under load. If I ease into it, yeah, as soon as it jumps to a 9 AFR. We're literally running on 3 cylinders right now, boys. There's no spark there whatsoever. That's misfiring at an 11 AFR. I swapped the coils too. What the hell is going on? This is a single cylinder misfire. It's something on cylinder 2. The one thing that I did not do is a leak down test. Definitely gives you a more accurate result. But at idle, if I rev it, there's no misfire. This sounds dumb, but we're gonna see what happens. Let's hold this thing at 6,500 RPM in a launch control, build some boost, and see if it starts to cut. Oh yeah, that is automatic misfire. Oh God. Boys, the smoke coming out of the exhaust there, I saw it in the mirror. Shit, we might have cooked her. Well, I didn't want the video to be this long, but unfortunately, it looks like that's the way that this is going so far. We have gone through the steps. We moved the ignition coils, replaced the spark plugs. The misfire did not follow from cylinder 2 to cylinder 4. So we just ruled out it is not an ignition coil issue, or else it would have followed and the misfire would have been on cylinder 4. We know that spark plugs weren't causing the misfire because obviously we just replaced them, gapped them to 30 thou, and the misfire is still there. So that covers spark. We haven't actually pulled the plug out with the coil connected and to verify that there is actually spark in that cylinder. But for now, I'm gonna assume that there is because the car idles fine. And if the car's idling fine and not misfiring at idle, that means that that cylinder is firing at idle. And that's why this is now leading me to believe that we might have a burnt exhaust valve or intake valve, but on these cars it's more common to burn exhaust valves. But we have one last final hope, and at this point it's Friday. Tomorrow's Saturday, which is when we're supposed to be at the track, and unfortunately it's not looking like we're gonna make it. Our final hope of not having to pull the engine out of this car again and put new valves in it is this guy right here. Our fuel pressure staying consistent, but we could have a sticky injector on that cylinder. Even though in my head, I'm thinking if the injector was bad and it was sticking, it would be misfiring all the time, right? It wouldn't be misfiring under load. But if you had a burnt exhaust valve, you would also think that you wouldn't even be able to cruise on the highway. It would be misfiring all the time with a burnt exhaust valve. So the logic's not really making sense here. All I know is we've ruled out ignition coils and spark plugs and probably piston rings because our compression test was okay. So this is either a burnt valve or a bad injector. Alright, we got the cylinder 2 and 4 injectors flipped now. Let's pray that this misfire comes up on cylinder 4. Oh, I don't even want to get into it. I'm scared. Is that AFR jumping to a 9 right away? I don't know. Nope. It's on cylinder 2 still. Oh, we got a burn valve, boys. Oh my God. This is a sad day, boys. See, I might sound smart in this video and sound like I know what I'm talking about, but when it comes to diagnosing an issue on a car, mechanics don't know everything. They can only go off of the information that is provided to them, and then they rule out certain factors to find the problem. And that's what we're doing right now. We have one last thing that I can check before we do a leak down test. No, there's no way. Let's go to the racetrack, fuck it.